Well, good morning. If we haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Daniel Newman. I am one of the trustees of the Prayer Book Society and part of the conference organising group. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. We've heard about the use of the language of the prayer book. We've heard about architecture and the prayer book. And now we're thinking about the prayer book and its relationship to music as we continue to think about what has the prayer book ever done for us, how it's shaped our culture, and what it can still hold for us today. So we're thinking this morning about music, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Gant. Andrew, would you come to join me at the microphone, please? Andrew, this isn't your first time in Cirencester, is it?
No, not by any means, no.
Could you explain why you were here most recently?
Well, yes, I spent quite a bit of time in Cirencester just over a year ago when I had the honour to be a candidate for this constituency in the general election. It's very nice to be facing an audience that doesn't get a vote.
We'll have a much more friendly reception here.
Like that.
Between 2000 and 2013, Dr. Gant was organist, choir master and composer for Her Majesty's Chapel Royal.
Church musician, the short answer is probably everything. I was looking back through my book about English church music the other day, and I found that I've written the sentence, there are lots of fine composers in this book, but there's little doubt about who is the finest composer for the English church. It's Thomas Cranmer. I stand by that statement. For composers, the Book of Common Prayer has basically given us three categories of texts that have really formed the backbone of English church music repertoire. The canticles, sung on a daily basis and often, of course, very often set to music. The little prayers for the cycle of the church's year, known as the collects, and perhaps above all, the translation of the Book of Psalms. But of course, like the prayer book itself, this was not an event, but a process. The move towards rendering these texts in a language that people could understand and could use and could sing themselves was already several centuries old. For example, this is a translation of some verses from the Psalms written by a Yorkshireman called Richard Roll as far ago as 1340. Ready my heart, God, ready my heart. I shall sing and I shall psalm say in my joy. Rise, my joy, rise, my psaltery in the heart. I shall rise in the daying. I shall love the name of my God with song, and I shall sing to thee in nations. Blow in the new moon with trump. Take the psalm and give the tabor, and psaltery delightable with the harp. I shall sing to my God as long as I be. A little later in the 14th century, the Wycliffe Bible, largely written in Oxford, of course, has this version of Psalm 23. The Lord governeth me, and no thing shall fail to me. In the place of pasture there he hath set me. He nurtures me on the water of refreshing. He converted my soul. He led me forth on the paths of rightfulness for his name. For why, though I shall go in the midst of shadow of death, I shall not dread evils, for thou art with me. Thy yard and thy staff, they have comforted me. Thou hast made ready a board in my sight against them that trouble me. Thou hast made fat mine head with oil, and my cup, filling greatly, is full clear. And thy mercy shall sue me in all the days of my life, and that I dwell in the house of the Lord, even to the length of days. The work of Cranmer is clearly part of a continuum of that joy and pleasure in turning these wonderful texts into English that you can enjoy speaking and you can enjoy singing. The process, of course, gathered pace in the lead-up to the Reformation and to the production of the Book of Common Prayer. Henry VIII's minister, Risley, attended a service at St Paul's, Old St Paul's, of course, in 1545, where he heard, and noted in his diary, Paul's choir sang the procession in English by the King's injunction, which shall be sung in every parish church throughout England every Sunday. The momentum, the move towards a new English prayer book was building up. Of course, like many things in the latter years of Henry VIII's reign, it wasn't an entirely straightforward process, and there were contradictions and twists and turns and other factors coming into play. Probably the key document for the musician in the development of these texts is a letter that was written to Henry by Thomas Cranmer in 1544. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it's so important that I'm going to read you the relevant extracts just one more time. Cranmer says this: "I have translated into the English tongue, so well as I could in so short time, certain processions to be used upon festival days, the judgment whereof I refer wholly unto your majesty, and after your highness hath corrected it, if your grace command some devout and solemn note to be made thereunto, as it is to the procession which your majesty hath already set forth in English, I trust it will much excitate and stir the hearts of all men unto devotion and godliness. But, in my opinion, the song that should be made thereunto would not be full of notes, but, as near as may be, for every syllable a note, so that it may be sung distinctly and devoutly, as be in the Matins and Evensong Venite, the hymns, Te Deum, Benedictus, Magnificat, Non Committis, and all the psalms and versicles. The Latin note, as I think, is sober and distinct enough, wherefore I have travailed to make the verses in English and have put the Latin note unto the same. Nevertheless, they that be cunning in singing can make a much more solemn note thereto. I made them only for a proof, to see how English would do in song." And that is the classic statement of what this was all about. And I think it can be summed up in one word: clarity. The idea is to make the words intelligible to the listener and to the performer. And the instruction to the musician is to use the art of music to enhance that. And how does Cranmer do that? Well, first of all, it's interesting to note that he says he actually made the first experiments in writing the music for this new liturgy himself. But how did he do it? Well, he adapted the Latin, what he calls the Latin note. In other words, he took the Gregorian plain song, the tunes, that people already knew, and he simply adapted the words from Latin into English and made the English fit the old tunes. So you're changing things, but you're not trying to change them too much. You're trying to allow people to carry on doing things that they are used to and are comfortable with. And that is very much in the spirit of the ideal for the musician that this prayer book and its antecedents were after. There were also some settings by professional composers, if you like, trained, proper composers, of English texts before the Book of Common Prayer. Christopher Tye, who was organist of Ely Cathedral, set the Nunc Dimittis, but his text was not from the 1549 book, but from a 1535 primer, and the text that he set goes like this: "Lord, let thy servant now depart in peace according to thy promise, for mine eyes have seen the Saviour sent from thee, whom thou hast prepared before the face of thy people, a light to lighten the Gentiles, to be the glory of thy people of Israel. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, and is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Always so be it, so be it." The word Amen has to be translated into English. I think that is actually a unique example of a setting of an English canticle which predates the Book of Common Prayer, and it's a very beautiful piece. So we move on into the reign of the boy king, the devout Protestant, Edward VI. The injunctions of 1547, of course, a new reign, lots of new instructions going around telling everybody what to do. And as usual, there's a lot of instructions about how you are to manage worship. And as usual, music is kind of bolted on as a bit of an afterthought. For example, the injunctions sent to St George's Chapel at Windsor said, "The choristers shall daily say matins in English before the beginning of service in the morning, and likewise evensong in English before the choir begin evensong." Which is interesting, actually, if you think about it. They are to say matins in English before the service, which kind of implies that they were still singing it in Latin, because that's what they'd always done, but they were meant to make sure that the choristers understood what it was that they were about to sing by reading it through in English first. Quite an interesting idea. And then came the prayer book. One of the key things for the musician about the Book of Common Prayer, as the great historian Peter pointed out in his wonderful book about the music of this period, is that it doesn't actually say very much about music. There's a distinct lack of specific instructions about where the music is supposed to go. It's clear that music is expected. There are references to clerks. You're told when they should kneel down and stand up. Clerks are singing men, so there are singers there in the service. But it doesn't, for example, say, whether the psalms should be sung, and if so, by who, certainly not to what. And of course, the most specific reference to music is the famous instruction as part of the rubric to matins and evensong. In choirs and places where they sing, here followeth the anthem. But that's it. What anthem? What text? In some other church traditions, the texts for a particular day are very firmly set. If you're going to sing, you sing this, but not here. Now that, I think, looking at the subsequent history of the music of the English Church, has been a source of a certain amount of disagreement and a certain amount of argy-bargy, but also, I would say, a huge source of strength and creativity, because it has, to quite a large extent, allowed musicians and liturgists to interpret that instruction in all sorts of different ways, which has meant that composers could draw on a huge variety of texts to set and sing as anthems. And the Book of Common Prayer provided them with a wonderful resource, so that you can have passages from the Bible, you can have passages from the collects, you can have passages extracted and indeed edited from the Psalms, and as time goes on, you can have devotional poetry, hymn texts, and other things as well. One of the great strengths for the musician of the Church of England has been its inclusivity and its willingness to sort of welcome in texts and influences from outside. The second prayer book of 1552 was even less helpful to the musician, gave even less instructions. There are some musical settings from this period. As always, there are difficulties about being precise and exact about dating the music for various reasons, not least because things get changing. But there are two main collections which reveal how composers and musicians began to engage with this new generation of English texts. The collection known as the Lumley Part Books, named after the family that looked after it at Arundel Castle in Sussex. All the texts are in English, but they are not in the Book of Common Prayer versions. They are in metrical versions, and this is a really key distinction, which will become important as the history unfolds. So, for example, this is a short selection of verses from the canticle Benedicite, the morning prayer, in the prayer book version. O ye showers and dew, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever. O ye winds of God, bless ye the Lord. O ye fire and heat, O ye winter and summer, O ye dews and frosts, bless ye the Lord. Praise him and magnify him forever. Familiar text. This is the version of the same text that is in the Lumley collection. Ye rains, ye dews, ye boisterous winds, O winter and summer, O fire and heat, moistures, frosts, and cold in your kinds, ye nights, ye days, and ye snows great, lightnings and clouds, darkness and light, O praise the Lord, both day and night. So you can hear the makers of this new repertoire really relishing the opportunity to use the vigour and the rhythm of their language to express something in their own tongue. And the music matches it. It has a real sort of swagger and a verve that goes with it. The other collection from this time is by far and away the most important source for the music of the very early English church music tradition, known as the Wanley Part Books. And the main difference there is that the texts in this collection are from the Book of Common Prayer. including some of the earliest liturgical settings. There is indeed a setting of the English Communion service, the very first new setting of the English Communion, by a composer called John Heath, not a name that's often heard on music lists these days. It's not very good, but it is there, you know, it's remarkable. There's also some rather interesting experiments with these new words, because, you know, again, as Peter Lehere says in his book, one of the problems with this new liturgy was that not a note of music existed to sing to it. So one experiment was to take some existing music, some Latin mass settings by John Taverner, a composer for the pre-Reformation Catholic Church, a composer of wonderful polyphonic music in the old-fashioned style, and to try and bolt the new English words onto it. And that's what they did, and this music is published. So the idea of sort of, you know, one's onto the tune of another is not new. It doesn't work very well. Psalms in metre become extremely important for the musician. And of course the idea is that you can sing them. And in particular, if you put the psalms all into the same kind of metre, you can then sing any psalm to any tune that you already know, which happens to be in the same metre. And this became extremely common and extremely popular throughout this period. One of the earliest ones was published by a man called Robert Crowley in 1549. And most importantly of all, a version by two Edwardian courtiers, Sternhold and Hopkins, which over the following 150 years, right the way through to the turn of the 18th century, sold, you know, probably hundreds of thousands of copies. The Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. So, in a sense, you have a tradition which is running in two parallel trends. The Book of Common Prayer, with its prose psalms, is essentially providing music for trained composers writing for professional choirs, if you like. Places like the Chapel Royal, private chapels, Oxford and Cambridge, and cathedrals. Everybody else sings their psalms to metrical versions, which they can buy in cheap, popular editions, in single ballad broadsheets, and sing at home or at school, led by the head of your household, your school teacher, or your parish clerk. And these things run in parallel with each other. The most important document for trying to realise Cranmer's ideal came just a year after the Book of Common Prayer itself. It's called the Book of Common Prayer Noted, and it's by a musician from Windsor called John Marbeck. Marbeck had an interesting career, certainly wasn't dull. Brought up, of course, under the old Catholic dispensation, he composed music for that rite. He composed a Latin Mass in the old-fashioned polyphonic style. Very fine piece, very much in the style of composers like Taverner and Ludford. As the Reformation gathered pace, he found himself in sympathy with it and became a convinced reformer. Musically, this is reflected in one of his mid-career compositions. It's a little carol in 3 parts called A Virgin and Mother, very much the sort of thing that was designed to be part of the use of music for education, for general sort of edification. Then, on the 16th of March, 1543, his lodgings in Windsor Castle, where he was employed as a musician, were searched, and writings of John Calvin were found. Well, this was too far, even for the modest steps in the direction of reform that were going on under the last years of Henry VIII's reign. Marbeck, along with 3 colleagues from Windsor, was tried by his own dean in his own place of work, found guilty and condemned to die. What followed was a terrible, horrific event, even by the standards of the time, known as the Windsor Burnings, commemorated in some gruesome woodcut illustrations in Fox's Book of Martyrs. But for the musician, the interesting thing is that of those 4 men who were condemned to die, 3 went to the flames, and Marbeck did not. Marbeck was reprieved on the explicit and direct instructions of the king through the intervention of Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who was one of the prosecutors in chief. Why? It's really difficult to know, except that, perhaps, musicians were valued for their music, and there are other instances where you can draw this inference during this period. Anyway, Marbeck survived and went on to pursue a very successful career as a musician, and wrote some fairly polemical books criticising the Pope and papists, which left little doubt where his sympathies lay. But as far as music is concerned, his key achievement and his key contribution was this book, the Book of Common Prayer Noted. And he realised, to a very successful extent, Cranmer's ideal. He took the liturgies of the Book of Common Prayer, the canticles, the psalms, the creed, the Lord's Prayer, and he fitted them either as closely as he could to the existing Latin plainsong tones which people already knew, or to tunes which sounded as much like them as he could make them. So you change things, but you don't change them too much. You make people do things in a new way, but you don't do it so that they can't get hold of it or they won't like doing it. He succeeded brilliantly. It was a task which was exactly matched to his inclination and to his musical experience. And I think the surest test of the success is the fact that all of us here still sing the music of John Marbeck. He took Dominus vobiscum and turned it into The Lord be with you. And then when the text changed again from and with thy spirit to and also with you, the music goes with it. So that same process that Cranmer started and Marbeck effected still carries on. And I think it's a remarkable testament to his achievement and to the flexibility and inclusivity of the tradition. As far as, if you like, posh composers are concerned, there were some who wrote music for this early liturgy, men like Richard Farrant, Robert Parsons, Thomas Corston, not necessarily the most famous names in English musical history. Their music has a sort of experimental feel, they're feeling their way. Some of the early music of William Byrd during his period as organist of Lincoln Cathedral may include some of his early English settings of the canticles. Nothing like the grandeur and spaciousness of the later ones that he wrote probably for the Chapel Royal in London. But there is one musician who really stands out at this period for doing something amazingly distinctive with these new English canticle texts, and that's John Shepherd, who was a gentleman of the Chapel Royal and also the organist, or informator, or college starling, as they still call it, at Magdalen College in Oxford. Shepherd wrote a number of settings of the evening canticles, and they are just simply amazing. His second service is a huge piece. It divides the choir into multiple parts. It's very long, it's very difficult, and it's a simply wonderful piece of music. And when you consider that this is, right at the very beginning of this tradition of setting these English pieces and compare it with what was being done around him, his achievement really stands out. He's a composer who's really only sort of come back into public light just in the last few decades, thanks to the patient work of a few scholars. But he really is an absolutely great name and a key figure in the musical legacy of these texts in the Book of Common Prayer. Wonderful music. And so these texts make their way into the new world of the Elizabethan and the Jacobean age. Elizabeth's first injunctions of 1559 clearly show her engaging with music for the people that she describes as such a delight in music. I always think that when she used that phrase, it's pretty clear who she had in mind, herself. The great period of the setting of these texts is what used to be called the golden age of English music. It's a slightly sort of hackneyed phrase, but it still makes sense, I think. If you think of the list of names of these composers: Byrd, Gibbons, Weelkes, Tomkins, Edmund Hooper, a name less well known today. And these texts matched the development of style. The short service style, or the full style, for the choir all singing together, sometimes with instruments. The great service, very long, very elaborate, for special occasions in the Chapel Royal, probably. And perhaps most of all, what's known as the verse style, where passages for choir alternate with passages for solo voice. So here, perhaps for the very first time, you can begin to hear composers really engaging with the sound and the stress and the shape of English words. In my view, one of the first and one of the greatest composers to really do this was Orlando Gibbons. If you listen to his verse anthems, the way that he uses the English language and matches it to the solo voice is, I think, unparalleled in English church music. You know, Henry Purcell maybe comes close, but a wonderful interpreter of these words from the Book of Common Prayer. Little pieces like Almighty and Everlasting God, O Lord in thy wrath, a psalm text, or verse anthems like O God, the King of Glory. Gibbons also did something which English composers have occasionally allowed themselves to do, which is fiddling around a bit with a text. When he was awarded a degree in Oxford, part of the trial, if you like, was to compose a flashy piece of polyphonic music. Gibbons wrote a setting of a prayer book psalm, "Oh, clap your hands together." The last verse of that psalm, as printed in the prayer book, goes like this: "The princes of the people are joined unto the people of the God of Abraham, for God, which is highly exalted, doth defend the earth, as it were, with a shield." Well, Gibbons didn't settle that. He left out the first half of that verse. He just simply left it out. It's not there. He didn't set the bit about the princes of the people and the princes of the God of Abraham. Why? Did he perhaps think that those words are just too wordy, too fiddly? Or did he just forget? Who knows? I might add here that I once had a conversation with a very distinguished and now very senior English church musician, a well-known composer, where we both discovered that we had on one occasion set a well-known text from the Book of Common Prayer, which we both thought we knew very well, and set it from memory, and then come back to it afterwards and found that we'd actually left a bit out. I won't tell you who that was. It was the organist of York Minster. So then the trick is how to get it back in again. Anyway, so you get this parallel tradition going on. You've got wonderful music by professional composers for professional choirs, and you've got metrical psalms for congregations and for singing at home. Sometimes you get both things printed in the same book. There are all sorts of different versions of the psalms. This is the opening of Psalm 84 from the prayer book. "Oh, how amiable are thy dwellings, thou Lord of hosts. My soul hath a desire and longing to enter into the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh rejoice in the living God. Yea, the sparrow hath found her an house." This is that same psalm printed in a psalter issued by Thomas Ravenscroft in 1623. "How pleasant is thy dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, to me. The tabernacles of thy grace, how pleasant, Lord, they be. The sparrows find a room to rest and save themselves from wrong, and eke the swallow hath a nest wherein to keep her young." Common meter. Yes. While shepherds watch their flocks by night, as seated on the ground, there is a greener far away without a city wall. The idea is you can sing any text in the same meter to any tune which you already know. And incidentally, just a little aside here, the tune that Ravenscroft printed with that psalm goes like this. "How pleasant is thy dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, to me, the tabernacles of thy grace, how pleasant, Lord, they be." So the story of how tunes move through this tradition alongside the words is another tune. Beginning of the 18th century, a new version of the Psalms comes into existence to kind of take over, if you like, from the old version. And this is the version by Tate and Brady, came to be known as the new version compared to the old version. Just give you one little example here. This is the opening of Psalm 3 from Stonehold and Hopkins, the old version. Lord, how are my foes increased, which vex me more and more. They kill my heart, while as they say, God can him not restore. It's rather sort of fire and brimstone, isn't it? And slightly sort of simplistic language, if you like. This is the version from the more enlightened age at the end of the 17th century. How numerous, Lord, of late are grown the troublers of my peace, and as their numbers hourly rise, so does their rage increase. Insulting they my soul upbraid, and him whom I adore, the God in whom he trusts, say they, shall rescue him no more. It's all rather more polite, isn't it? So the Psalms, went out into all lands. There are different versions in Scotland. There are different versions which went across the Atlantic to America. The Bay Psalter, the first book to be printed in North America, and incidentally a copy not that long ago became the most expensive book ever sold at auction. 1640, printed in Massachusetts. 1645, everything changed. The Book of Common Prayer was abolished by law. For the musician, it looked as if that was it. The tradition was gone, and of course, that it was going to come back. William Child, who served for almost the whole of his long life, he lived to be 90 years old, as organist of St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, composed a beautiful, fine, old-fashioned lament to the psalm text, O Lord God, the heathen are come into thine inheritance. And he marked it on the part books, it says, for the abolition of the Book of Common Prayer, 1645. A very beautiful piece. Of course, Child lived to see the tradition restored, 1660. We have a wonderful first-hand account of that in the diary of Samuel Pepys, a very keen musician and regular attender at choral service. 22nd of November 1663. The Chapel Royal Choir, by the way, was refounded by a man who'd been part of it before the Civil War into England, called Henry Cook, who fought on the Royalist side and was always thereafter known as Captain Cook. 22nd of November 1663, Lord's Day, to Whitehall, at chapel, the anthem was good after the sermon, being the 51st psalm, made for 5 voices by one of Captain Cook's boys, a pretty boy, and they say there are 4 or 5 of them that can do as much. And here I first perceived that the king is a little musical and kept good time with his hand all along the anthem. The boy was a young man called Pelham Humphrey, who went on to succeed Cook as master of the children at the Chapel Royal. I've done that piece. It is a very fine piece. 51st Psalm. So it's the Book of Common Prayer that gets the musical juices flowing again. And of course, none more so than one of the other 4 or 5 boys that Pepys mentioned at that time, although just of a slightly younger generation, the son of one of the adult members of the choir, a little boy called Henry Purcell. Perhaps nobody has ever made such joyous, rich, life-affirming music out of the words, the music of the Book of Common Prayer than Henry Purcell. Let's just take one example. You may well know his first anthem, They That Go Down to the Sea in Ships. There's a wonderful story attached to it. It was written for Purcell's friend, a wonderful bass singer by the name of John Gosling, who was famous for his low notes and got all his composer friends to write him these very elaborate solos, including Purcell. Well, Gosling, as a member of the royal household, was ordered one day to accompany the king and his brother, Duke of York, later James II, on a sailing trip. And they went off down the Thames, and a storm blew up, and the king and the duke and everybody else had to sort of handle sails like common sailors to get the ship back safely into harbour. This terrifying event so impressed Gosling that he asked Purcell to write him an anthem to commemorate it, which he did. They That Go Down to the Sea in Ships, complete with the ship being brought safely back into the harbour. And it's a wonderful piece which begins with a 2-octave scale from the D above middle C down 2 octaves right down to the D at the bottom of the bass stave. But there's another little interesting detail about that, which is that the first verse of the psalm text is this. They that go down to the sea in ships and occupy their business in great waters, these men see the works of the Lord. Now Purcell did a bit of a Gibbons here. He said, they that go down to the sea in ships, these men see the works of the Lord. Just like Gibbons, he left out half of the first verse. Again, why? Did he just think, and occupy their business in great waters? It's just not a very interesting thing for somebody to sing. He wants to get on with the fun bits. But again, English composers have felt themselves able to edit, to chop and change the text of the Book of Common Prayer with some incredibly creative results. The next great musical interpreter of these texts was a man who arrived in London from Germany just only less than 20 years after Purcell died, George Frederick Handel. The coronation anthems, what can you say? Wonderful music. There's an interesting example of how composers anthologize and edit texts in one of Handel's no fewer than 5 settings of the text, As Pants the Heart for Cooling Streams, obviously based on a psalm text. Because in this particular anthem, he doesn't choose between the metrical Tate and Brady version and the Book of Common Prayer version. He actually uses both. So that when he's writing a sort of formal aria, which needs a bit of a structure and a bit of a rhythm, he uses Tate and Brady's metrical version. But not all of it. He chooses the bits he wants. As pants the heart for cooling streams, so longs my soul for thee, O God. Then when he gets into a recitative, which doesn't require any kind of meter, he uses the rather earthier version from the Book of Common Prayer. Now when I think thereupon, I pour out my heart by myself, for I went with the multitude into the house of God in the voice of praise and thanksgiving, among such as keep holy day. So he's done both. He's alternating one and the other. It's a rather interesting example. And of course, the anthologizer-in-chief among English musical librettists was Handel's friend and collaborator, Charles Jennens, who provided the libretto for Messiah. Many psalm texts, of course, in Messiah, although interestingly, Jennens preferred to use the Bible versions rather than the BCP versions. He also was not afraid to change bits of the text to make them fit together. For example, the aria "He was despised" has a middle section, "He gave his back to the smiters." Well, in the original version, those are not both in the third person. So in order to make it coherent, he felt himself perfectly able and perfectly permitted to change the text for musical purposes. Meanwhile, if you like, the sort of more vernacular tradition of psalm chanting carried on in a rather sort of rough and ramshackle way. This was written by Richard Steele, the editor of The Spectator, when he listened to a parish choir and congregation singing a psalm accompanied by their organist. For half an hour together, they divert their auditors by scouring up and down the whole compass of the organ, skipping from one subject to another, taking a special notice of their tuning the psalm, for in the middle of a word, Mr. Tweedledum forgets the tune and entertains us with a scrap of a song or a masquerade dance to the confusion of the audience, when the next verse, perhaps of confession or deprecation, shall be introduced by Lily Bolero or Jumping Joan. Musical standards were certainly not anything to write home about at this period. Parish choir books began to appear, again drawing on the Book of Common Prayer. William Tanzur's Harmony of Zion contains his setting of I Was Glad. It's like sort of bad Handel, but it's made for parish church choirs out in the countryside, a new development. Taking a little sideways step, in America, a rather remarkable, untutored musical genius by the name of William Billings produced his own versions of several psalm texts as part of the wonderfully idiosyncratic shape note tradition, including this, Lamentation over Boston. By the rivers of Watertown, we sat down and wept when we remembered, O Boston, Into the 19th century, we've already said that perhaps the period around the turn of the 17th century was the first great period for music engaging with the words of the Book of Common Prayer. The second great period, I think, has to be the second half of the 19th century. And the main driving force for that were the high-minded, idealistic Victorian clergymen who made up the Oxford movement, and in particular men like John Mason Neale, the hymn writer, and his colleague Thomas Helmore, with whom he collaborated on a large number of musical endeavours. Standards weren't always great, and there were a series of battles, often quite literal battles, between the various wings. Congregation versus choir, English versus Latin, Gregorian chant versus Anglican chant. But perhaps the key achievement and the key innovation of the Oxford movement for the musician was their insistence that the Book of Common Prayer psalms could and should be chanted in the form in which they appear in the prayer book. Now this was a slightly anomalous idea. The whole point of putting psalms into metre is to give them a rhythm, so that you can sing words which have a rhythm to a tune which has a rhythm. What the Oxford movement tried to do was to put words which don't have a regular rhythm to a tune which does. And that is where the tradition of Anglican psalm chanting that choirs do today really came from. And there are all sorts of fascinating experiments about how you do this and how you get people to sing together and whether the congregation should join in. There's a great story about the composer Antonin Dvorak, who was on a visit to London in the 1880s, and he was taken to evensong at St Paul's Cathedral. And he stood there with his companion, and the choir stood up and started singing the psalm. He listened politely for a few verses and turned to his companion next to him and he said, "Why does the choir keep singing that wretched little tune over and over again?" So we're into the 20th century and, in a sense, into the modern age. I think it's fair to say that perhaps in the early part of the 20th century, modernism and musical modernist composers did not find the rather fuddy-duddy and reactionary Church of England and its traditions something that they wanted to engage with. Church music didn't lend itself very well to the serial style, for example. That has to a very large extent changed, and today you find serious, engaged, world-class composers like James McMillan, Judith Weir, and before them the generation of Benjamin Britten and William Walton, engaging very thoroughly with these texts with some wonderful results and making a remarkable contribution to our musical tradition. Other composers have engaged with it for the benefit of parish churches, very much associated with the work of Ralph Vaughan Williams, editor of the English Hymnal, of course, and his friend Gustav Holst, both of whom wrote settings of canticles for the use of village choirs. Still very good music. So, what has the Book of Common Prayer done for us? Where do its echoes appear in our modern tradition? Well, just listen to this little passage from a poem which W.H. Auden wrote specifically for musical setting by his friend William Walton. It's from the poem The 12. O Lord my God, though I forsake thee, forsake me not, but guide me as I walk through the valley of mistrust, and let the cry of my disbelieving absence come unto thee. It's not so much echoes of the Book of Common Prayer, it is the Book of Common Prayer. And of course it's easy to hear those same echoes in poetry by T.S. Eliot, so set to music by Benjamin Britten, and indeed in other places too. What has the Book of Common Prayer done for musicians? Well, I'd like to take a little slightly sideways step, really, just to get towards an end here. I think that the language of the Book of Common Prayer has permeated into English thinking and English life in ways which are far broader than just church music or church liturgy. This, for example, is an extract from a song by Noel Coward. It's written to be sung by a woman, and it goes like this. I believe in doing what I can, in laughing when I must, and crying when I choose. I believe the more you love a man, the more you give your trust, the more you're bound to lose. And I believe that since my life began, the most I've had is just a talent to amuse. I believe, I believe, I believe. Where did he learn that habit of doing things in threes? Noel Coward was a choir boy at the Chapel Royal. But it is there. It is there. No doubt about it. Take another little digression. This is one of my favourite ones, and it's not really a reference to a text from the Book of Common Prayer. It's from a song by Cole Porter called Don't Look at Me That Way, where the singer says this, I'm very mild, I'm very weak. My will is strong, but my won't is weak. So, what is the long-term legacy of the Book of Common Prayer? Well, it reminds me a little bit of when Zhou Enlai was asked what was the long-term effect of the French Revolution, and he said, it's too early to tell. But I think I'd just leave you with one thought. For the musician, the Book of Common Prayer has in a sense become a symbol of a divide. You have your evangelical church, and then you have your more traditional church down the road with a board outside saying prayer book services. Well, that wasn't what it was intended to do. It was intended to do exactly the opposite. The music of Marbeck is one of the very few traditions that you will hear sung in both places. That is what the Book of Common Prayer has done for us, and we should treasure it and value it, not just for its inherent beauty and meaning, but also for its inclusivity and its welcoming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gant, for that sweeping account of how the prayer book has shaped music, not just in this country, but around the world. And I think it's picked up on a theme that we've been hearing throughout this conference, that when you want to seek reform, you preserve continuity with the past. You don't change too much, but you do adjust some things. We've seen that with architecture, we've seen that with language. If I might ask the first question, you ended by saying that the prayer book has become a symbol of divide, particularly between evangelicals and others, and that it wasn't intended to be that way. And I wonder if you could offer some thoughts about how that divide might be crossed again today.
Musicians haven't always been very good at solving that problem, have they? I don't know. It's so sad when music gets caught in the crossfire of these divisions. It does still happen, and I wish it didn't. I don't know the answer to your question, except that tolerance and acceptance and liberalism still has a place.
So, we've got the floor to questions. If I could just say, not everyone has a strong voice, so be courteous towards those if you can't hear their voice. And I will repeat the question so that we can all hear. Who's got the first question in the front row?
I was interested, I think you said that the Anglican chant tradition that we enjoy now emerged kind of in the 19th century. Did I understand that correctly? I just want to know if you could explain sort of what would psalms have sounded like, the more metered psalms in the 17th, 16th century. Because I guess up until 5 minutes ago, I always thought that tradition had come from Morton. So.
Yeah.
Did everyone hear that question?
I have to say that until I wrote my book, I kind of assumed that as well. It was very interesting, actually. I think the short answer is that they would have sounded like what we now think of as hymns, sung in a regular meter, and in a regular repeating tune, full bar harmony. Yeah.
There was a hand up at the back.
Yes, I sometimes derive minutes of pleasure from singing House of the Rising Sun to the tune of Talis Cannon. I wonder whether you think there's any mileage in going, do things the odd way round. Might it be possible, or even might it be desirable, to set any of the texts of the Book of Common Prayer to modern music, or is the content of the words of the Book of Common Prayer bound up with a certain tradition of form?
Absolutely not, and I absolutely agree with you that we should regard this wonderful legacy as available to all kinds of music. Absolutely, that is really key. Actually, the psalm chants of Sternhold and Hopkins were popular music. They were folk songs, Greensleeves and Ein Feste Book and all this kind of thing. So, perhaps this is partly an answer to Daniel's question. Yeah, we absolutely must not regard this as something exclusive that only sort of posh trade musicians can sing as sort of free music. No, there's a wonderful song, slightly off the track, by Paul Simon called "American Tune." Just a guy with a guitar, but the tune is the Passion Chorale from, as used by Bach. So, we must absolutely regard those words as available to everybody, into every musical style. Yes.
Question in the front row here.
Okay. So we stagger through psalms and stuff with the village. There isn't even a choir, it's just the congregation trying to sing the psalms, sometimes without pointing, which drives me mad. I am a professional singer, so it's almost unbearable. And my vicar asked me to ask you. When I told him that the subject of this talk, is there a way around this? Can we, what you told me about metrical settings, it sounds marvellous. Could we, without upsetting too many people, put the metrical version of the psalm in for the congregation, who would all breathe a sigh of relief and be able to sing it, because it's going to be like a hymn, isn't it? It's going to be like a hymn tune.
Yeah, we do sing metrical versions of psalms, but we sing them as hymns.
Yes. Yes, obviously, yeah.
When you sing "The Lord's My Shepherd, I'll not want."
But if there was a metrical version of the psalm set for the day,
yes.
Would there be too much horror?
I think the answer is yes. I think you could do
Good,
that.
he'd be really happy. Thank you.
Yes, I don't want to get into trouble.
All right, no, I won't.
For your congregation.
Gentleman in the second row.
Could I ask you about the status in law of the metrical versions? Because, of course, in the 16th century, they're very, you couldn't produce your own version of the Bible, but here are bits of the Bible in metrical form, and I don't know what sort of permission they had.
That's a very good question, and the short answer is that they were not designed and not allowed to be sung as part of the liturgy. That's absolutely right. Yes, it wasn't permitted. So, in fact, the injunctions that Elizabeth I introduced on her coronation referred to what was called an hymn being sung before and after the service, which is a very typically Elizabethan bit of neat footwork, because it means that you can sing your congregational hymn before the liturgy is started, which is okay, and then you can sing another one after it's finished, which is also okay. But you're quite right, that wasn't legal, and actually, during the whole of the 18th century as well, you could only sing in the liturgy what was in the prayer book or what was in the Bible, and nothing else. So no, metrical psalms were not included. And of course, it was the tradition of hymn singing and the Methodists and all of that that finally sort of broke that down. But yeah, they're different. They're different. Those are not liturgical music. That's a key distinction.
Question in the front row here.
I was brought up on Arthur Wills, Stanley Vann, Francis Jackson, Sumption, Brewer, and so on. And not all, but a great amount of music written for the Book of Common Prayer has come from that school of college cathedral. It's very expensive. Llandaff have just dumped theirs. What will happen with Wakefield, Bradford and Leeds, who knows?
Bradford's future is very safe.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear it. Is there a lot of the choirs now are down to 12 boys, or is their future rosy?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? You're quite right, it is expensive. There are certainly challenges, and at a parish level too. A parish in Oxford where my son sings in the choir, is having a big appeal to get its music going, as churches often do. I think I just make two comments. First of all, I think cathedral music generally at the sort of high end is in pretty good nick at the moment. Cathedral choirs are generally very good and well run, professionally resourced, backed up by lots of professional support from places like the RSPN. You know, the people who run them are generally well trained and well supported. The other point is that this isn't anything new. You know, I mean, church music during Elizabeth I's reign suffered enormously from financial problems because of inflation. You know, during the Restoration, you know, the symphony anthems of Purcell and all of that only happened at all because Charles II essentially liked having a party and not worrying about whether or not you could pay for it. And his successors, William and Mary, found that they could not pay for it, which is why it stopped. You know, it's nothing to do with liturgy or taste or musical style. It's all to do with money. So I hope so, and I do think so, because I think that there are enough people who feel passionately enough about the tradition.
Question?
I was taught at school that English is a musical language, and we were taught hymns where the music fitted the English. And now, very often, we go into church and we're told that we're going to sing a certain hymn, but it's a modern or more modern music which doesn't fit the English music. Can you explain any reason for it?
Well, I think I wouldn't characterise this as a problem between one style of music and another style. I think it's not right to say that, you know, modern music and worship groups and that sort of thing are less musically good than traditional.
I'm not saying that.
In the way that they approach the words. I mean, I think it's a question of whether it's done well. You know, there are some very fine modern hymns which have deservedly entered the repertoire, but there are some rather bad ones. There's quite a lot of bad Victorian hymns. So I think you need to persuade your vicar and your music leaders to make sure that they use the best ones.
There's a question at the back.
You've been talking about the musical tradition of the Book of Common Prayer, but of course now common worship is increasingly used. Do you think that there will be a common worship musical tradition, and is it going to displace the Book of Common Prayer?
Will it displace it? No, because the musical repertoire is already there. You know, and there's so much wonderful music already that there's no way that, you know, if you want to run a choir singing in the church, you will have to carry on using that repertoire because it's just so good. But will there be a repertoire based on the new text? I hope so, yes. And there are indeed some examples of that. I mentioned James Macmillan, and he has made some wonderful settings, you know, if you like, sort of proper choral music, of texts from modern liturgies, congregational masses, and also from the Scottish prayer book. So there's absolutely no reason why not. I think it's probably still fairly early days, but yeah, I think probably we should all try and take steps to make sure that that does happen.
Do you have a question, Alistair?
Yes. I wondered if I might just probe a little bit more the context of the future of the tradition, looking slightly beyond our own shores. Because there is a very real sense that the Anglican communion is, of course, global, and I'm very conscious of an occasion when I visited Marbeck Cathedral on Good Friday, and was slightly surprised to hear the Lamentations of Jeremiah, followed by the Allegro Miserere. And obviously it's not done perfectly, but that was done at all was striking. And in conversation with the director of music afterwards, he said, well, it was very difficult because the bishops felt this was not the way forward, and they really would like to eliminate it. And I heard something similar in a number of other places, which makes me think that we could do more to support the tradition around the communion, because that in the end would also help us preserve the tradition here, because we would have a greater uniformity. I just wanted to raise the thought that we might think of ways of doing that, which could include, of course, sending choirs perhaps for their week trip overseas rather than just within the United Kingdom, and exchanging perhaps organ scholars and so forth. So that's one point. But the other was to ask, I suppose, an intractable question, but it's is in continuity with the one we looked at earlier with regard to architecture, where we were thinking about where bad architecture works. In other words, we've had the case of a large congregation that meets in a supermarket space or whatever and grows and grows. Well, that clearly has done so in the face of the congregation, in the face of the space the congregation has grown. Similarly, what does one do to move people on from what we might, no doubt reprehensibly in the minds of some, call bad music, who use bad music? How do we move them on to be something in a better place in terms of the tradition?
You describe that as an intractable question, so maybe we'll just leave it at that. Yes, I mean, every place is different, isn't it? You know, I mean, it takes a lot of political and diplomatic skills to try and do that, but it's worth doing. On your first point, yes, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the Royal School of Church Music does very good work in this respect. You know, it has branches all over the world, and of course, choirs do travel quite widely. And you know, export the tradition in that way. It's a lot more difficult than it used to be, in my experience. You know, going to America, for example, the requirements of visas and passports and things are a lot more stringent than they used to be, probably for good reasons.
Time for one more question. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Possibly a silly question, because I can go home and look it up. In the run-up to Common Worship, we were given a new calendar. And listening to some of the names that you've mentioned, the question first came into my mind when I realised that Marbeck avoided musicians for being so hugely influential over the centuries have been included in that new calendar.
Does that question mean how many musicians are saintly?
Not many, in my experience. I don't know the answer to that, no.
We're going to look it up. I can't think of any.
No.
Marbeck,
No. I mean, it is just sort of not, I'm going to not answer your question, but, you know, Marbeck escaped the flames. It is actually quite interesting that musicians, generally speaking, got away with it. You know, even people like William Hunnis, who was involved in a conspiracy to murder Mary I, survived. You know, William Byrd, who sailed pretty close to the wind at times. I think they played the game quite well.
Thank you very much for answering our questions, and I think let's give Dr. Gant a round of applause.